Welcome to the Scottish Property Podcast. This is a show where we aim to educate, inspire and entertain through real life stories and interviews from people in the Scottish property community.
As always, thanks for listening and give us a follow on social media and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Remember to join us at our monthly networking events on the first Wednesday of every month. Tickets are available on our website. So without further ado, we'll just cut straight into this week's podcast. First of all, Willie Rennie, thank you very much for joining us in the Scottish Property Podcast.
It's good to be here. Unfortunately, I like debating and discussing housing because it's been a crisis, certainly in the last few years, if not longer than that. But yeah, it's good to be here.
It's one of those things that for a long time you would hardly ever hear about housing in the papers, on the news agenda. You know, it's so far down probably, and also on the political agenda, obviously yourself debating in Parliament and that, it wasn't ever really much of a talking issue. But obviously in the last couple of years where we've seen this severe shortage in affordable housing, it's become one of the main things. And obviously we've just had the UK general election where it's really played out at high level, when that was one of, you know, Labour's big manifesto pledges was to obviously build the 1.5 million homes, and that was a big political debate. So you must have seen, obviously been a long time in the game in politics, you've obviously seen that change as well from your constituents and what people are telling you on the ground.
I've never seen it so bad. I've been doing this for 18 years now. I represented the other end of Fife, Dunfermline, and now I'm representing kind of St Andrews and all that patch, East Neuk. So they're very different areas, but I've never seen it as difficult as this.
And you operate in a patch similar to where... You operate in a patch similar to where I grew up in the village next to you in Gateside, and live in Dunfermline, went to school in Belbaxter, and my property investment career spans that full length as well. And I agree with you, I've never seen it as bad. Demand for rental properties, demand when it goes on the market, like there's just so much shortage and so much people needing affordable homes.
Can you give us an idea? People, obviously, as part of your job, you're MSP for North East Fife, is that right? You're obviously out. You run surgeries. You speak to local people. Give us an idea of what people are telling you.
So there's people that sit on housing lists for years on end with no prospect of getting a home. There's people in accommodation that's damp, that's really quite unsuitable, it's unhealthy, full of mould. The council say it's condensation. In reality, it's damp and it's mouldy and it's not good for them. And then there's people who want to work in places like the East Neuk of Fife, but can't afford a house, or St Andrews. You find it's very difficult to get family homes within St Andrews, so you end up having to move out.
Why would that be? Why is it? Why are people finding these problems? Why is there such a shortage?
We've not built enough for years, and that's partly planning, partly money, but just partly we've had a number of economic recessions, and obviously the housing market gets hit in every opportunity, on every one of those occasions, and we've not really managed in the good times to build sufficient numbers at the pace we're required to build them at. And also, it's much more complex, the needs now. So there's people who have got disabilities to a degree that we've never had before, and the housing is just not suitable. So we're building new houses that are in a much better disability compliant zone, but old housing is lots of steps, and people incapable of getting up and down the flats. All of that is made it a much more complex housing environment. So for all those reasons, it's just been really, really difficult to get the houses built quickly enough.
You touched on St Andrews there, and a lot of your constituents will struggle to buy in areas like St Andrews. Did you support the changes that were recently changes with the short-term legislation that got brought in last year? Because I'm assuming that hugely affects St Andrews area and the price of the accommodation there.
So we didn't support the licensing, but we did support the control areas.
Yes.
So we thought the licensing was unnecessary and cumbersome, it was solving a problem that didn't exist. We don't really have a problem with party flats in Fife. We've got a problem of there's too many short-term lets in Fife. Now, I'm not against short-term lets. I support them. But when you have too much of a good thing, it causes a crisis. So in some communities, it's all second homes, almost, and short-term lets. So I favour the control areas to cap the numbers.
Like your Celadike and your Ely's and your East Nooks.
I mean, there's a housing estate that was built in the far end of Crail called the Balcomie Estate. At the back, it's social housing, so that's protected for local people. At the front, almost all of it is either second homes or holiday lets. Yeah. Now, why would any community agree to a new housing development if almost all of the private housing that's available is going for short-term lets and second homes? It means, as a result, is that local people can't work locally because they can't get a house locally. That's not good for the businesses either. We need cleaners, we need people who maintain the properties. We're going to end up with just holiday lets and second homes and nothing else. Therefore, the holiday lets will be hit because there'll be nobody to work with them. So that's why we need to change that.
And would that just be a case of implementing, strict rules through local government and councils to implement that kind of cap? Is that the way that it would be implemented in your approach?
Because they've cocked up the licensing arrangements so much, we've not even got anywhere near the control areas. So we've not got, councils have been scared off doing the control areas because Edinburgh City Council, for instance, has ended up in court numerous times. So we're not making the progress on the areas that I think we should be making progress on. And I would also I'll give you another positive suggestion, right? Because I'm going to oppose an awful lot of what's been talked about in terms of government policy. But let me tell you one thing that could work really quite well is the rural housing burden. So if you've got a largely benevolent landowner who's got properties on their estate, they would like to bring them back into use, but doesn't want to put them into holiday lets or second homes, wants them to be available for local people, you can put a burden on it that says it has to be made available for local people through a special housing list. But that allows people to get on the housing ladder. It allows people to buy a property with an equity share maintained by a trust. But then we can start getting landowners developing, building on their estates in a way that's sustainable, but means that people can get on the housing ladder and we meet local housing need. That's a positive thing. I would rather the government spent more time investing in rather than doing things like licensing or even the cap on rental property.
So this kind of, obviously you're Liberal Democrats, SNP is the current administration in Scotland. Is this kind of blanket approach then just to put a licence on everything? Was that the wrong, in your view, was that the wrong way to go?
Some areas of the country would want a licensing system. We actually think a registration system would have been far better. So you just register the property, but the burdens associated with it are much less. We think that would have been a sensible way to proceed, because there are very few people who were crying out for a licensing system. Even Andy Whiteman, who was seen as one of the advocates for this area, saying the government's got it all wrong. So it's just this, you get mission creep when the government comes up with any ideas. They gold plate the proposals and they end up harming the sector they're trying to help.
Almost using like a sledgehammer, one blunt approach to something that could have been resolved or controlled, because like the suggestion you just made there about a registration, almost like the landlord registration, at least you can actually gather data and start understanding where there's a constraint, where there's a saturation of short-term lets, whereas the way they had it, they didn't. It was like one blanket approach. We've got a situation in Edinburgh, let's do the whole of Scotland across it, and you'll see areas like St Andrews being really affected.
Can you tell us, Willie, obviously being in Parliament and knowing the kind of workings of government and all that, it feels like to us in the industry that they come out with these laws, legislation, and it feels like they're never really consulting the people that are actually working and the people that know and the experts in the industry, and they're just coming out with these things without actually doing the research or speaking to the appropriate people. Why do they do that? And why do they not seek more advice from the people that actually are in the know?
Yeah, I think they see you as a problem. I think that's it. I think
us, as in you're saying, private landlords, investors. I mean, we get it, right? Because we're not naive enough to think that any politician's going to stand up in Parliament and obviously,
back the landlords,
argue for the landlord. Obviously, we know that, we're a very small percentage of the voting population, probably less than 10%, and that number is dwindling, right? So you've got to go where the votes are as a politician. But it's not even just property stuff, it's business stuff as well. They're rolling out these policies, the number of failed things that the SNP Green has put out there. They just didn't seek the correct advice, and none of it made sense. It's the same with the housing policies as well. The rent caps, which has put off a lot of institutional investors, your pension money and all that, which were quite happily come to Glasgow and Edinburgh to build big apartment blocks, they've all gone, no, we're not going anywhere near Scotland now. At what point did the government not think to consult these people who were investors bringing the actual money to the table to make a thriving economy?
I think they have a problem in understanding that things they believe that are positive, that everybody else doesn't accept are positive too. So they should have, in this particular case, consulted and understood that landlords and investors are partners rather than enemies. And that we cannot solve the housing crisis without everybody being involved in that solution. You can build all the social homes you want, and let's say we did meet all those targets, we'd still have a shortage of housing. So we need private landlords, we need private investors to make this work. And it was interesting, I did an intervention during one of the housing debates, and it was Shona Robeson, who was the cabinet secretary for housing effectively at the time. Patrick Harvey was one of our junior ministers. But I said, look, you're going to have to work in partnership rather than seeing the housing investors as the enemies. And she was up on her feet within seconds. Now, this was before all the realisation that the investment was disappearing was happening. So she was live to it. She understood that they were on the verge of tipping over into disinvestment. So they weren't ignorant of it, they understood it. But they were partly beholden to Patrick Harvey at the time, who was determined to drive this through. So there's a bit of politics, there's a bit of naivety, and there's also the coalition. So there was all those things combined together, which made the situation what we see today. So I think the sooner they realise that you're partners rather than enemies, the better chance we've got of solving the housing crisis.
And do you believe that there is a place for the private landlord, if you like, the maybe the person that's got a bit of money to invest and they want to build up a little bit extra income in their retirement and stuff? Or do you think that some political politicians think that that just shouldn't be a thing? People should not be allowed to buy homes, taking them out of the community for their own profiteering.
The SNP have said they don't. They say that they are in favour of private landlords. They want good private landlords. They tell us that. I wouldn't be surprised if Patrick Harvey differs in that view, but he's not in government anymore.
Good riddance.
But I think the SNP do accept the private landlord's got a role to play. I think there has been consolidation in the sector, from what I can see, as part of the effect of all these changes recently. So the government have managed to engineer a concentration of wealth through this process, because the individual one or two property landlords, a lot of them are getting out. And it seems bigger investors are buying up those properties. So there is I don't know whether that's the evidence that you've got, but that seems to be what I'm hearing is happening.
Let's talk specifically about the rent cap legislation, right? So from our point of view, obviously it was frustrating at the time when Patrick Harvey was the kind of instigator, mastermind behind it, I think, to stop private landlords for increasing the rent at all. There was a 0% cap for a long time there. We get that as well. You know, as a politician, they're trying to protect vulnerable people. Obviously, there didn't look like there was any balance. You know, it was all in favour of the tenants from our point of view. That was frustrating for a while because at the same time as we weren't able to put the rents up, obviously we had rising costs in labour, materials for our renovations. We had rising costs in insurances. We had rising interest rates on our mortgages, which was the main thing. But as an unintended consequence, that obviously has had, now that the cap's been effectively legislation ended in April there, rents, if you look at stats, have never been higher. I think over the 10 years from 2010 up to pre-pandemic, you know, rent inflation went up very, very minimal, like 2% maybe a year or something like that. In the last year, you've seen rent increases of 12% in some areas. So you, if you were in government, Willie, and the Liberal Democrats were in power, how would you, during that time, got the balance right in terms of protecting tenants and also not causing this kind of problem in the market where basically we've got rents spiralling out of control now as a consequence of what happened, because there is now landlords selling up, it's causing a shortage of supply. Basic economic fundamentals say when you reduce the supply, the price goes up.
So a number of different things you need to do. You need to build more homes. We need to make the planning system simpler in order to get those homes built. We need to have a partnership at local level to make sure that local authorities are working with private landlords on rents.
See, can I just stop you there? See, the build more homes, right? That's an easy thing to say, right? And it's an easy thing to solve the problem. Build more houses, that's it, problem solved. Where does the money come from? Who's building these houses?
It's not just about money. This is about planning. So planning needs to be better. Planning needs to be speedier. We need to have more experienced planners within planning departments of local authorities who can process the applications much more quickly, so that developers can have confidence that if they go to the time and effort and investment, then they're going to get a return on that money in reasonably quick order. That in itself will unblock an awful lot of investment, because people are waiting to invest, companies are waiting to invest, but the planning system clogs up. So that's in part how you do it. So it's not just about government money. This is about the smoothness of the system. It's about how quickly can you get the applications through the process. We're about 700 planners short just now across Scotland. That's the reason why you wait for years on end, sometimes decades, to get land developed. So that's one of the big areas that we need to resolve.
So is this about allocation of funds to the appropriate departments, i.e. like you're saying there's a shortage of planners? Obviously councils, the reason why things take so long, I'm presuming, is because they don't have enough staff in there, they're under-resourced, the whole planning process just seems to be dragged out for years. So is that just a case of, is that a local council problem or is that a government problem?
It's a bit of both. And part of what happens is that when the housing industry is booming, a lot of those planners go and work for those housing developers. So you lose the experienced people. And then when there's a depression, the councils don't really have that much money to recruit experienced people. So you end up with a series of inexperienced people who can't process the applications quickly enough. And then you've got a government that layers on extra responsibilities with the National Planning Framework number 4, which has got extra responsibilities on the ecology front and on climate change. So you've got a landscape that's constantly changing with inexperienced people who can't process it quickly enough. So it's a really complex system, but the one thing that's for sure is that planning departments and local councils don't get sufficient support in order to make sure we can boost the economy, because this is a big economic question, not just a housing question. So that's why we're having that problem with that.
Let's take a quick break, guys, from today's show to talk about selling your property with Prime Property Auctions. Now, myself and Stephen have both used John and Lewis from Prime in the past, and we can personally vouch for their service. They sell vacant and tenanted property, and you get to control the minimum reserve price so that you're not selling your property for peanuts. They pay for all the stuff like photos, videos, and all the marketing stuff up front, so you're not paying anything from the start, and it's a no sale, no fee. So if you want to check out Prime Property Auctions, then get across to the link on the show notes and speak to the guys. I'm going to read you out. I'm sure you know these stats anyway, but just for the benefit of our listeners, so the SNP, I think it was Nicola Sturgeon, stood up and said target to build 110,000 affordable homes by 2032, but actually they've only been able to build on average 7,700 homes annually. There's also been a recent budget cut of 200 million to the affordable housing supply programme. The SNP would say that they just seem to blame it on Westminster and the block grant. So what's your comeback on that, your argument towards that?
I mean, there's no doubt that the Conservatives cocked up the economy, and it did have an impact on Scottish public finances. There's no doubt about that. But the Scottish Government itself hasn't boosted Scotland's economy to the degree that it should have, with the extra powers that the Scottish Parliament was gifted under the 2016 Act. So we should have been boosting the economy more, so we had a bigger tax take, and we wouldn't have been in this position to the same degree. But there is no doubt that Liz Truss's budget did really have a massive impact on the Scottish public finances. But the Scottish Government themselves hold a big part of the responsibility too.
I think we're all glad to see the back of Liz Truss, aren't we?
Yes, going back to the question as well on what you would have done differently when the government brought in the rent cap and eviction ban back then. I think you mentioned that the first one was the planning. What was the next one?
So planning. So the second bit is, I think you've got to get local authorities and private landlords to work in partnership better. So in Fife, there actually is quite a decent partnership.
There is, yeah.
Because they recognise that both have got the answers for each other's problems. So I think having that, so that there is a much better understanding about what rent levels are acceptable. And then I think the third area is, with that, then you build up confidence, and then you get more investors within the sector. And then we need to make sure the proper finance is available through the Scottish Government block to make sure that we build the houses that we need to build. But planning's a big part, partnership's a big part of it, but money inevitably comes into it too.
What's your reaction to, obviously, Labour win the UK general election? Do you think this is going to be a positive thing for housing? I mean, I know, obviously, housing has devolved in Scotland. How much of the Labour policies do you think will feed through into Scotland?
I hope it gives confidence to the house construction sector across the United Kingdom, so they all feel capable of investing more. And I hope the kind of the changes that are proposed, if not the sentiment, is proposed through the planning system, affects Scotland too, so we can have a much smoother system. So I think there will be things to learn by the Scottish Government off the UK Government when they're driving through these changes. So I hope it does result in something positive.
One of the issues that I've got with it is that they come out with this one. We'll build 1.5 million houses in the next 5 years, right? They've put the pressure on themselves anyway with that statement, but they can't do that themselves. A government is not going to go and build 1.5 million houses. They need, like you say, they need the developers, they need the big house builders on side, they need to come up with a strategy. Now, the problem we've got with that is, raised by another guest that we had on today, is that how incentivised are the big house builders going to be to start creating all this supply? Because as we know, they're in it to make profits. Then they've got land banks, they've got a lot of land that's sitting there. They could start building more houses if they wanted to. So how do you feel that's going to pan out? Because ultimately they're in to make the biggest profit possible.
Yeah, but they're not going to wait forever to get the margins that ideally they would maybe get. They need to get throughput, don't they? They need to get the volume of houses through in order to make the profit that they need to. So they can't just sit and wait. And I think if they've got a government that's on side, they might feel more inspired. Because it's not just about money going into housing. The money could go somewhere else, into another sector. It could go into, high-tech stuff. It could go into biological services. It could go into pharmaceuticals. It could go anywhere. So how do you make housing the place that investors want to put their money? And if you've got a simplified planning process with a government that's prepared to have some of the battles about where housing should go, then you're more likely to get the confidence from the sector. A lot of this is confidence. It's about certainty about what a government's going to do. And that's where the SNP have got it badly wrong, because people just didn't know where they were going to go. Or if they did, they thought it was going to ratchet up with ever more and greater responsibilities that were only going to lead to disinvestment. And that's the problem. You could agree a temporary short-term rent freeze. That's perfectly possible to do. But we know the intention was always to have a permanent rent control arrangement. And we've seen from the rest of the world that the rent controls, they end up being a rent floor rather than a rent cap. People, businesses, investors lift their rents up, because otherwise, if they don't, then they lose out longer term.
Well, that's
the problem.
Yeah, this is the next thing that we'll move on to, because obviously one of Patrick Harvey's parting gifts, if we should say that, was the introducing the housing bill, which has currently just been introduced to Parliament. Obviously, as a private landlord, we manage about 300 properties as well. I would say most of it, what is in the housing bill, is fine. Giving tenants extra rights to redecorate their homes, making it so they can have a dog or a cat, whatever. You want people to be happy in their homes. The biggest thing for landlords is obviously the long-term rent controls, and the fact that previously, with the previous emergency legislation, when a property became up for re-let, we could then reset that rent at the market rate, whatever we deemed acceptable, whatever there was demand for. Now that could have jumped up quite a lot from the previous rent that the tenant was paying. Obviously now they're proposing that there's going to be local government council powers basically to cap that, and that could be capped at zero again. In terms of you can't put those rents up past a certain threshold or barrier. Now that is quite scary. Again, that is government meddling in, a free market economy. What is your stance on that? Would you oppose that sort of thing?
We think we will oppose this measure in the housing bill. We are not persuaded that it's the right thing to do. It's not a national rent cap or rent freeze. It is localised. It could have been... There is a possibility that this will result in no change, because there has been rent control measures before with rental officers, and that went nowhere.
In the private residential tenancy agreement that was created in 2017, there was rent pressure zones within the lease that basically gave the powers to council, and there was never, like you say, it never went anywhere. Again, it's like, councils must be sitting there thinking, God, as if we've not got enough on our plate already. Do you know what I mean? We've got our education, which is a shortage. They've got, 400 redundancies in Glasgow in teaching. And now the government are landing the short-term legislation, the rent controls, as if they've not got enough on their plate to deal with.
You could be inside the council offices right now, because that's exactly how they feel. That they get these extra responsibilities, they spend ages trying to work out how they're supposed to use them, and spend a lot of money on it as well. So I think you're right, it could end up meaning nothing, but my real concern is I think they're missing the point, because what they need to do primarily is rebuild the relationship with the investor and the private landlord, so it's seen as a partnership rather than seeing you as enemies.
Did you see any...
Which sounds like just rhetoric, but the reality is, if we don't get that partnership to work, then landlords will find ways around these systems.
Did you find any harsh cases in with your constituents? Because I'm thinking of properties I have in your area, and during this whole time in the podcast, we were interviewing property investors with the same, thought process. There were landlords who like to look after their tenants, and I had one in Gateside near where you are, and the tenant was in there for 7-8 years on £850 a month, lovely family, looked after the home. The power was then taken away from me as an investor to put the price up. When that tenant left, My new rent was put up to the new market value rent, and because of supply and demand, I put it to the highest I could have, and I would never have done that ever.
That's exactly it.
And what happened in the result of that is the property price went from £850 to £1,400. Someone stayed in it for 6 months. It was an unsustainable rent that anyone could afford, and ended up having to sell the property. So the property went back onto a retired couple that weren't going up the property ladder, but that came out the private rental sector because it became unaffordable.
That's exactly the problem I was talking about, was that you feel compelled to treat any rent control as a rent floor rather than a rent cap. And therefore everybody raises their rents to a level that's just not sustainable. On other occasions you would have thought, how much can I afford and how much can the tenant afford? And then you pitch it at that level. So I think that's exactly the position the government's got into. It's broken that trust.
And how do you think the government then goes back to try and rebuilding that trust, if that's part of their play?
I don't know. Because how do you trust somebody that's done you so much damage before? I don't know. It sounds pessimistic. It would take a lot. And this shows that governments can do an awful lot of damage if they make the wrong decisions. I would say change the government altogether, but that's another couple of years before that happens. But that might be what happens. But we need to just think smartly about.
We do need change, and you've seen that with the UK government with the election there. We needed change. We needed Tories out. It didn't matter who was going in. We needed a change, and that might so happen again a couple of years' time with Scotland.
I mean, look, I've not got all the answers, right? If I was in charge of housing, there would still be problems. I would still be incapable of building all the houses I want to build. That would all happen. But we should stop doing damage to the sectors that we're trying to find solutions for them. We shouldn't be doing that. So,
what do you think about because obviously we speak to a lot of people in the sector. Somebody suggested, and I thought it was a decent suggestion, right? And they said it's time for the politicians to step aside on housing, and it's time to get a group of people that actually know what they're doing in the sector. Now, this could be in the private sector, ex-CEOs of house builders. It could be, the chief executive of Shelter Scotland. All the big players, get them into some sort of national, separate from the government, absolutely independent. Basically like what they did with the Bank of England, they made that an independent to come up with a policy for the monetary policy separate from the government. So there's no influence there. And let these people that know make the decisions and be a separate kind of...
Yes, I mean, we should be getting the best advice. But in some ways you want housing to be a big hot topic because then it's greater up the financial priorities list. Because there's a lot of this is about money. Where do we spend the money? And if it's not in the political range, then we don't treat it as a priority. So that's why I think, yes, you should get the best advice. Yes, you should work in partnership with the sector. And yes, you should have all these chief executives around the table. And often they do that. But ultimately the decision is a political one, because it's our job is to reflect what our voters think are the political priorities. Because if we don't, we get kicked out next time round. And chief executives are not accountable to anybody.
It just amazes me that people like Patrick Harvey can't come out publicly and say we got it wrong. We just got it wrong. You see, the proof is in the pudding. The data is there. As soon as the rent controls came in, bang, the rents go up.
But he would say, let me speak for him, quite a rare thing. he would say it's because we didn't control the in-between tenancies rent levels. We only controlled tenancy rent levels. And the new legislation will be comprehensive and will cover both. So he would say the reason why it didn't work to the same degree is because it wasn't big and bold enough. That's what he would say.
We try to get Patrick Harvey on the podcast a couple of times. We got absolutely blanked, didn't we? So again, this is another reason why we're very appreciative of you actually joining us here today, because you're the first politician that we've actually had on. We've been doing this podcast for nearly 5 years. We're actually trying to go down the route of trying to do more kind of general housing stuff, because a lot of it was just based on, investors and just people making money. There's more to it than this. We believe that we have a voice. We've got a decent following, a lot of people on YouTube and that. We need to solve this problem, all together. Like you say, it's got to be joined up. I just feel that part of the problem is that I think each sector can have its own place, and I think there's too much merging the whole thing to get the whole problem together. For example, social housing, totally separate thing. Affordable housing, totally separate thing from the business that we operate in. Because if I look at our 300 properties that we rent out, very, very few of them are actually people on benefits or what you would class as maybe vulnerable people, which I totally get. The rent cap should kick in to protect these people. When we implement a rent increase, very rarely are we getting kickback from people. These are people, most of our tenants are on high paying jobs. A lot of them are coming from other countries as well. Huge amount of immigrants coming in. They're never going to be able to buy their own home because they can't get a mortgage. So they are needing the private rented sector to provide that housing. So I believe that we have been dragged into this whole thing as the private landlord and absolutely vilified, when it's a totally separate issue, that the social housing, a totally separate thing, and that is the government that should be held accountable to solve that problem. It's not our fault as private landlords.
There is housing in general is not just a housing issue, it's an economic one, and it's also a social one. And everybody, I think, has to play a part in making this work. And we've not discussed much about the climate change obligations, that the energy efficiency of our properties is important too. Yeah. And you've got significant obligations now about the quality of your properties. And that requires investment. And you can't do both. You've got a rent cap that's so strict that you're not able to invest in the properties, and people end up paying more on their energy bills because their homes aren't insulated to a sufficient standard. So that's why we've just got to get back into a partnership and understand that it's a complex area that requires sophisticated people working in partnership to solve these problems. Mm-hmm. I'll take you to another place is in St Andrews, where there's huge numbers of student accommodation. And we used, before the PRT, before the private rented tenancy, the landlords and the students there had an understanding about when they would leave the property, and they began to leave the property, guaranteed to leave the property before the summer tourist season. So the landlords could use those properties for tourist lets. Now they can't guarantee that those students will leave because they're under no obligation to leave. So they've missed out of that market altogether. So their student rents are going up as a result, and because they can't tap into the tourist market.
And I
say it's not an unintended consequence, because I asked the Minister about it. I said, why don't you exclude students from this arrangement? And they refused to.
Yeah, I again, good point. Again, it's going back to this whole thing where there are bad landlords out there, right? And we want rid of them. Mm-hmm. As good landlords, we want to get the scumbags out, because it's dragging us down. If you look at our social media, and we do videos, we do Instagram showing off all our properties, Stephen does as well, puts a considerable amount of effort, time and money into making these properties a very high standard. Stephen, who's sitting here next to me, you've just renovated the HMO up in Aberdeen, very high quality accommodation. People are willing to pay that to be comfortable in a good quality home. They're not damp, mouldy properties like the Daily Record or the Sun would have you believe that all landlords are slum landlords, And touching on the energy efficiency stuff, so I think that's quite important. Obviously, again, there's no clear direction from the government on this. They are going in all sorts of routes with this. Initially it was going to be 2025, there was going to be a minimum EPC standard or something like that. It's now 2028, there's going to be, for private landlords, there's going to be a minimum requirement, but apparently the EPC is totally going to be overhauled. Heat pumps are the thing now, they're the talk of the day, but really, have the government actually got the correct advice? We're talking about, it's more so homeowners at the moment that they're being sold these heat pumps as the answer, right? And this is how we're going to get to net zero. There's experts coming out on social media and in the media, wider media, saying that heat pumps, they're no good.
I mean, they don't work for every property. I mean, I've got a heat pump in my property and it works perfectly well.
Right.
And I know lots of other people who've got them and it works quite satisfactorily. I think the issue here is the problem they've got caught up by rhetoric, where they want to have the best global standards, when actually what we should be working for is good standards, in fact, maybe very good standards. But if you go for excellence, it costs more and you build fewer homes as the result. So there's a talk about having a passive house standard. I'm not in favour of having passive house. If you look at what's involved in building passive house properties, it's an extraordinarily high standard. And the amount of chemicals and materials that you require are huge. You would never build a housing estate to that standard across, and expect to replicate that across Scotland because it is so expensive. So pragmatism is what's required in here. We want good, efficient properties that cut our energy bills. But why does that have to be the best in the world when we're trying to build houses at scale?
It's like this blanket approach, isn't it? It goes, we're needing to get the EPCs up. Well, heat pumps are the solution, and to do that, we'll ban gas boilers. But why is that the solution to it? Because your heat pump might work good because your house is very well insulated and it's got triple glazing. So start with, like you say, the EPCs at a decent level or good level, and then start increasing it to very good, not just this blanket approach to ban gas by this year. You're then trying to find a void or a replacement for it which might not be suitable.
So there is a bit about setting tough targets for the sector, the energy sector, because you've got to have a bit of certainty and quite strict targets. So when Nicola Stephen, a wee while ago, when he was Deputy First Minister, he said we want to have 50% of our electricity generated from renewables. We're way above that now. Because we set a target and we set it over a long period of time, industry came up with the solutions. So it does work, the target side. I was always sceptical as to whether that worked, but it does. So you need to have that, but you cannot chop and change all the time and expect industry to understand where you're going with confidence. You've seen, for instance, with EV cars, they've plummeted because the government set out the rhetoric that maybe we're not going towards that as fast as we were. Have certainty about where you're going, set the standards that are pragmatic and reasonable, and industry will meet them, even if it's tough. I don't want to have gas boilers in new homes. I don't want to have that. I would rather have heat pumps or district heating systems or solar panels on the roof. That should be the way that we're going. But if you chop and change all the time, it's no surprise that industry says, we'll just stick with a gas boiler.
You're talking about targets there, and it just brought back memories of obviously the SNP changing their target, and then that's what caused the whole fallout with the Greens, wasn't it? Which eventually cost the First Minister's job.
Consistency is an important thing.
But it's a really interesting time in politics. I mean, obviously there's a lot happening at the moment, Willie, all over the world. I love the drama of all the politics. So, hats off to you, to what you do, because it must be bang your head against a brick wall sometimes. And obviously you're putting yourself out there in the public domain. You're putting yourself out for all sorts of criticism as well. Maybe not so much criticism as the private landlords get, but...
What did they say? There's a pecking order, isn't there? There's kind of like nurses and doctors are way up here, then politicians and journalists are way down here. You must be below the floor.
Oh, aye, we're definitely for it.
Next to that, and parking attendants, I think.
Fantastic. Listen, I hope the next time you're in the Scottish Parliament as well, you'll tell all your colleagues about the Scottish Property Podcast, and we've got to try and line up some more MSPs. So what are you thinking? We should really get somebody on from the SNP. Is it Paul McLennan, who's the housing
try Paul
minister? So maybe try, if you bump into him, put a word in for us, because it's difficult. Because obviously, I mean, I get it. Obviously, if the BBC and STV come to you, you've got to want to do an interview. If Scottish Property Podcast come to you, then you're like, who the hell are they? But we do have quite a good following, so. Thank you.
It was a pleasure. I've enjoyed it. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. It's been a great chat, and appreciate your time. All the best.
Thank you, Willie. Cheers.
Thanks again. See you later. See you. Bye.